People, this video is about abiogenesis and the jump from archaea to eukarya. Some basic facts for you. I'm no expert, by the way, but I'm going to lay out some basic facts for those of you who question evolution and how one could have. First of all, the theory of abiogenesis is not the theory of evolution, so this is really just for the nutjobs who think that there's no way life could have arisen on its own. The people who talk about the starting point of life, only life comes from life. That is actually not technically true. There's a theory called abiogenesis that says non-life can make life. For instance, basic understanding of biology would prove that the people who think life can only come from life are wrong. Now, firstly, it's important to clarify, that has nothing to do with the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution presupposes that life existed. It's called the diversity of species. The diversity and origin of species, not the diversity and origin of life. So evolution itself as a theory makes no claims as to how the first life forms came about. It's claiming how life operates once life exists. And this is a fact. But for the nutjobs who still think that evolution deals with the origin of life, that's abiogenesis. But actually, abiogenesis is a lot more evidence than any religious claims. For instance, the last culprit available for the origin of life is a strand of nucleotide called RNA. It's a cousin of DNA. RNA has been observed making both DNA and proteins. And the three most basic building blocks of life are DNA, RNA, and proteins. All are required for a cell to function. And since RNA is known to be important in both the process of making proteins and DNA, and can make both, the theory of abiogenesis in most scientists' favor is that RNA were trapped in a naturally forming phospholipid bilayers, and we know phospholipid bilayers, the cell membrane, are naturally forming. They form without cells all the time. They form naturally. So what would have happened in the current working of the theory of abiogenesis is strands of RNA that could make both proteins and DNA would have been trapped in a naturally forming phospholipid bilayer. The chemical processes would have resulted in the first cell, DNA and proteins, with RNA inside. There may have been something else to it, but it's perfectly plausible, and has nothing to do with evolution, but it's perfectly plausible, and it would have been like a protocell that divided and led to all forms of life. It's perfectly plausible. And for those of you who can't believe how the most basic cell could have become the more complicated, that it has everything to do with evolution. Once the cell begins to divide, evolution and mutation takes hold, which would inevitably have made it more complex. For instance, one perfect example of this is the jump from our bacteria to archaea. Archaea, for those of you who aren't familiar, are a type of prokaryote that are not a bacteria. No, not all prokaryotes are bacteria. Now, archaea are typically larger than bacteria, typically more complex, but not as complex as eukaryotes. We, for instance, are eukaryotic organisms, multicellular. Now, not all eukaryotes are multicellular, but the vast majority of eukaryotes are multicellular. There are no multicellular life forms that are non-eukaryotic. All multicellular life forms with more than one cell, are eukaryotes. What enables this? Organelles. Organelles are like little organs what's inside the eukaryotic cell. They don't exist in archaea, and they don't exist in bacteria. Now, how did the first organelles come about? Well, interestingly enough, there is mountains of evidence to suggest that archaea, who fed upon smaller bacteria, swallowed but did not digest bacteria, and these may have become some of the first organelles, such as mitochondria and chloroplasts. And that's how the first eukaryotes came about. And once the first eukaryotes came about, the first multicellular life forms could come about. Technically, I guess there's other multicellular life forms that are prokaryotes. I believe they can form colonies, but they operate independently. They don't operate like eukaryotes, like of a complex life form like we do. So I don't know if you'd refer to them as traditional multicellular or just a colony. They're more just a colony of sister cells. But eukaryotes are more complex, and hence they produce more complex organisms like human beings. And there's mountains of evidence to suggest that the first eukaryotes evolved about 2.8 billion years ago, when an archaea swallowed, chomp chomp, a bacteria cell, and that became the mitochondria. For those of you not aware what mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They produce, through cellular respiration, pretty much all the ATP the cell will ever use. It's a fascinating process, and even the most basic understanding of biology could lead you to a very enriched knowledge of how life began, how life operates. It's quite fascinating. I have only the most basic understanding, and it's still mind-boggling to think about. Yeah. Signing off. Prometheus. Bye. Peace. Oh, and as far as abiogenesis is concerned, one last thing. The idea that only life comes from life is absurd, because you need life to be eternal, and we know life is not. Which means it had a starting point, which means it came from non-life, because the universe didn't start out with life. We know this. Unless aliens came from another universe. Which I doubt. Well, people can go on clinging to God and believing that only life can come from life, but that's not the case. Abiogenesis is the working theory that we know the cell membranes form naturally without cells. Happens all the time. We observe it in nature. We know RNA can be used to store genetic codes. Happens with viruses. We don't even classify viruses as living organisms. We classify viruses as something else because they don't replicate on their own. Instead, what they do, the viruses that have RNA, is they hijack DNA to replicate themselves, but they store their genetic code in RNA. So not only can RNA be used to store genetic code, so DNA is not the only genetic code nucleotide in the world, despite what people think, RNA also can store genetic code. And RNA can be used to produce DNA and proteins. And diseases are actually caused by proteins, free-floating proteins, that actually replicate themselves by hijacking other proteins. And RNA can be used to make DNA and proteins. And we know it can store genetic code. And there are these things, free-floating RNA strands, that while they're not life forms, they replicate themselves. And could you imagine a free-floating RNA strand getting trapped in a phospholipid bilayer? Oh my god, you might have the first cell! Without any interference from God! Sorry, had to do that. Goodbye.